Hello and welcome to these conversations on curating art practice and writing in times of isolation and social distancing. Hope you enjoy and welcome to Homework. Thank you, Harold, for taking the time to talk to us about your practice and suggest maybe some possibilities for sustaining work and ideas that you could develop through thinking about how to sustain practice in these kind of times of self-isolation. Just to give a quick intro for those listening, Harold Offeh is an artist and reader at Leeds Beckett University, also a doctor, and his practice has a real focus on the body and its movements, gestures, and its actions in space, or its more locations in space. So, hello, Harold.
Hello.
Hello. Did I
Hello,
miss any?
Paul.
Hello. Did I miss anything there?
No, that's good. That's good. Thanks for the intro.
Well, what I would like to do is I'm going to go through a couple of ideas of thinking through your practice. I'm going to go back in your archive to 2002 to start with 4 Ways to Feel Amazing, and bring it right up to date when talking about Mindfully Dizzy and some of the other works that you've done along the way. But really to talk about like the potential of the body, the relationship of the location of place and what that means to the making of your work. Because in a talk recently you did at Mima School of Art and Design, you talked about performance not necessarily just as a medium, but as a series of gestures or actions. And I think your practice and the way you care and have empathy with the communities you work with will have a lot of skills and ideas that could develop forward in these kind of really trying times of how to sustain working collectively when we can't physically be in the same place. So I'm going to start with talking about 4 Ways to Feel Amazing, which was a work you did in 2002. And your website does have a lovely quote on there from Emma Dexter, Tate Modern, which the reason why I wanted to talk about this work was because it was a simple gesture of a 4-step plan to a better life. And I think that suggestion in itself of something that's tangible and also using quite like a clear humour within it, but also really focusing on the idea of being, might have some kind of relevance within how to make work within the confines of thinking about our studio as our home space. Did you want to give a bit of insight into that work and how you came about making it 18 years ago?
I know, that's so scary. Yeah, I mean, the work actually emerged. I mean, it's sort of a bit of an anecdote, really, but I'd received, for some reason, over Christmas, and my birthday is actually New Year's Day, so I'm one of these people that get Christmas and birthday presents wrapped into one. But I'd received all these self-help books, which as a gift is a kind of a bit of a flag. You're like, okay, somehow people think I need to kind of engage with some kind of, I need to do work on myself. But yeah, and one of them was actually called 50 Ways to Feel Amazing. And I was really interested in how the distillation of kind of Western philosophy, Eastern philosophy, spirituality, mysticism into these like short sound bites. The idea is that you would kind of look at these self-help texts on a daily basis as a kind of regime of kind of self-improvement. And I sort of just became really interested in more the kind of sort of the rhetoric and the frame of them, and really thinking about how the language was kind of sort of pitched in a particular way. I guess I'd been doing a lot of work where I'd been sort of trying to activate texts through actions. So really thinking about you know, the gap between language and meaning, and then how that can be transcribed into actions. So, I mean, what that often meant was just, what happens if I do what a text says? So the kind of literalism as a way of kind of like creating this space of absurdity that somehow like kind of ruptures or makes one aware of some of the subtext perhaps within within the text itself. So yeah, the structure of the piece is I chose 4 kind of scenarios, and I decided to kind of put myself in these situations, and then I sort of read the text as a kind of voiceover. So it's almost kind of a sort of internal monologue, really, that is sort of played kind of on top. Yeah, and I think, I mean, like within a lot of my work, I'm sort of interested often in kind of sort of overtly humour. I mean, not that necessarily things have to be funny for them to be successful or not, but that sense of kind of like the absurd or the ridiculous or this slightly peculiar or kind of strange. But for me, that's often a kind of sort of device as a kind of way into perhaps engaging an audience.
Yeah.
And the thing that I really liked about these like self-help books was that really one function of them, and it is perhaps problematic for some people, particularly academics and scholars, is that it is trying to distill quite complex thought to a very mass popular audience. So things are, but for me, that's also, it was an opportunity to really engage with some quite complex ideas that had been kind of like oversimplified, but then try and add in some complexity or some strangeness to them.
So it worked quite well as a nice starting point. You know, I like the way that you were thinking quite literally within the work to act out what those texts as instructions mean. You know, and for me, that kind of the origins of doing that come from like a Fluxus instructional based work, and I can't even remember the name of the artist who did it. My favourite Fluxus work is called Cat, and the instruction is buy a cat, and I quite like the the literal nature of what that means for making. So when you were taking these kind of very literal suggestions from these self-help books, what did it feel like to actually just like release those inhibitions to just do the act?
In some ways quite liberating, but I don't know. I mean, it's weird. At the time, I was doing a lot of work where I was filming it myself. Like, so I was a kind of a weird closed loop. So I'd set up a camera and then start it, and then I would do this. So there wasn't ever anyone else in that space, sharing that space, or kind of, you know, doing the filming. So yeah, in a way, I was kind of sort of always kind of sort of in a bubble. It's kind of perhaps a bit narcissistically. I mean, one of the reasons that I was sort of interested in video, I mean, when I was doing my BA in Brighton, I really got into a lot of kind of the early video artists that were kind of making these. I mean, this is like analog in the late 60s, early 70s, kind of, and I guess that move away from sculpture and painting into kind of dematerialized forms like text-based work, sound, video performance, and like, I mean, we'd be presented these videos, you know, by people like Joan Jonas and Vito Conci, Adrian Piper, and they all, Bruce Nauman, and they all seem quite dry. These like black and white, blurry kind of. And I remember I think reading some Dan Graham letters and correspondence that he was having, and I realised that actually they were just like a lot of the time just pissing about, actually. And this stuff that somehow over the passage of 30 years had seemed quite dry and formal through this kind of grey blankness was actually more akin to kind of like, you know, like MTV, kind of like super playful, trying stuff out, being experimental. Um, and I think for me that I really sort of gravitated towards video, and that's a very DIY, and not like precious about like aesthetic or sort of technical prowess. Actually, how can you translate an idea, or what's the possibility of video purely as a medium, and forgetting about film language and things like that, you know. So I became a sort of real geek for this idea of just like gonzo DIY video, where you just, you know.
Oh, definitely. And I think that that approach really comes through in the work, not necessarily in a direct way straight when you first see the video, but once you start to really understand like the deadpanness of the humor and that kind of relationship between, you know, like the possibility of blackness really within the work in a self-help context, which is mainly driven by a white Western cultural mass that mainly focuses on white middle class success, whether that's to quit smoking or help your lavender grow better, isn't it? So it's those series of cultural placements within the work as well, isn't there?
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, yeah, I mean, yeah, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think those books are always kind of sort of, I mean, they're always very much framed towards a kind of sort of like privileged white middle class, I guess, in terms of their kind of sort of suppositions and assumptions about time, and space, in order to kind of like adhere to some of these regimes. And yeah, and I'm obviously, one of the things I'm sort of kind of conscious, but also not conscious of, is just being a black subject that's being filmed. And I think that for me, that's also something that came out I came out as black. Yes. No, but in a way, actually, that is sort of true in terms of like, you know, because I think when I began to put myself in the work, suddenly you have to kind of negotiate, and I think this happens also, I think, for you know, a lot of women or people of color generally, or kind of queer bodies as well, is that there's a sense of your subjectivity has a kind of cultural resonance. I mean, you're just you, right? So if you're doing stuff, you're just doing stuff. You just live in this body. But actually, when it's framed and presented and disseminated, distributed, it has cultural resonance, which is linked into histories, politics, you know, economic value and stuff. And then you have to deal with that.
Yeah.
So, you know,
I think that kind of position where you're talking about the body and that placement of the body allows me to kind of jump through a couple of works at the same time. Snap Like a Diva, which is probably one of my favourite works of yours, which just has this great kind of character to it, and the humour and the deadpanness and the just the colour palette is really, really interesting. And I think it has a really great resonance with an understanding of what it means to think about the body, and what does it mean to derive a subculture to claim ownership over your own body in some way. I mean, do you feel that was like the aims of the work, or was it to think more about that relationship of performance and the body and performing, voguing, snapping, those relationships?
Yeah. I mean, I guess I mean, the starting point for the work was actually just coming across, and partly we're trying to reclaim queer histories and thinking about like the idea of like languages of queer bodies. And I came across this clip on YouTube of Marlon Riggs, who was an African American filmmaker who made this film called Tongues Untied. It was a documentary, kind of a poetic documentary about sort of queer African American men in the early 90s. I mean, this is in the period of the height of the kind of HIV/AIDS crisis. And yeah, it's just a really beautiful film. And there's a section of it where he kind of lays out this language of snapping, what we call clicking in England, is to the Americans is snapping. And he sort of lays out how that gesture is part of this kind of queer Black culture in terms of like people using it to accentuate conversations and dialogues. And he's been incredibly playful with it, but he's also celebrating it. And yeah, similarly, I mean, if we think about like voguing and the whole ballroom scene, which is of a similar period, because films like Paris is Burning are kind of, and now the TV series Pose are kind of similarly kind of reflecting on the cultural value of those things. And
yes,
I think at the time I was just really like, oh my God, this is just this amazing bit of like queer history, and it's also a kind of choreography, a language. And I kind of really just wanted to kind of mark that and celebrate that. And the kind of workshop format was a way of kind of like animating that and getting people to kind of engage with it. And for me, it's always framed by referencing Marlon Riggs and really directly referencing the kind of the cultural vernacular in which it sort of comes from. But yeah, allowing people to kind of engage with it as well. So.
I think that's, you know, you keep saying all of these amazing key words, which is like reanimating history, the humour that's embedded within that, but also giving people opportunities to activate those histories themselves and to embody them and realise them through their own body's potential. And I think for me that kind of even jumps forward into some of the newer work that you've been working on, whether that's the selfie realness workshops, which are in themselves really an interesting proposition. I know that you were doing some at in it was in Birmingham, wasn't it?
In Birmingham,
yes.
I was meant to be coming to Middlesbrough as well.
You were meant
summer.
to be coming to Middlesbrough this summer. I know, it was such a shame. That will definitely, hopefully, still be happening. I really
so.
hope it does. I think that idea of the selfie choreography, kind of pulling on from Snap Like a Diva, is still kind of doing that same gesture of exploring how movements, bodies can animate a moment or a history. Just, I don't know whether focusing on like selfie choreography, are you really kind of, is that meant to be as kind of playful and deadpan as it sounds? Is it meant to be like tongue-in-cheek selfies on a selfie stick are ridiculous, and this is how we're going to perform them and own them?
yeah. I mean, it is meant to be playful. Yeah. I mean, I think, I guess I was sort of interested in like, again, this is a bit anecdotal, but I mean, when at the height of selfiedom, when they were like a proper craze, there was, you know, there was a backlash by museums and galleries. Like a lot of them banned them because they were potentially dangerous, people pulling out things, not looking where they were sort of kind of going. But I was always fascinated by watching people and how people would perform in relation to, you know, this form of image making and this apparatus that helps one compose an image of oneself. And again, for me, it sort of really harked back to the origins of particularly video art. So there's this famous essay by an American critic, Rosalind Krauss, where she talks about early video art being narcissistic, because a lot of the videos that were being made in the 70s were, you know, somebody would just perform in front of a camera. And for me, that has a resonance with like sort of the kind of selfie culture, obviously. How do we author and frame ourselves, but with this weird tool? And then I think by the time I sort of got round to really trying to formalize that, I was asked to do a workshop for a series of summer workshops. the selfie moment had happened. No one, apart from middle-aged tourists, which I'm now in that age bracket, of course. So
no way, no,
it has
not,
more
not
resonance.
true.
It does. Um, nobody, no self-respecting person would ever pull out a selfie stick. Really, just don't do it. I mean, Instagrammers and all these other people don't do it. You just hire somebody to photograph you or whatever. You don't, So I like the fact that it's now kind of slightly weirdly redundant, but there's a kind of and deeply unfashionable. And again, but for me, it was really interesting to think about this thing about performing to the camera and what are the possibilities of that with this apparatus, like, and extending what it allows you to do. And just thinking about it as a kind of almost like a kind of Franz West adaptive, this thing that is extended to the body, but also then can document the body or not, or can, so, and again, the kind of choreography thing. I'm not a trained dancer, but I'm always interested in the idea of the potentiality of just a body, particularly untrained bodies. And everybody has an ability to kind of move. And through that movement, there's a possibility of making meaning. And I think for me, there's something about a selfie choreography where it's just like an endless possibility. And actually, there's no technical skill kind of required. It's just pure play, I think, and permission to play.
Well, maybe that's a really great point as well. Is that it's bringing into that element of playfulness, allowing the body to be liberated from its own restraints, isn't it? Of like freeing up oneself to perform in front of a camera in the same way of the way you're harking back to the origins of video art practice, and that narcissism within video art, kind of playing out and playing with that idea into selfie choreography. And you can kind of see those connections right through from the early video work right through to where you are now and what you're trying to pull together. And I think that kind of comes through in terms.
I haven't moved very far in 20 years, Paul, have I?
You've moved really far. I just think there's a narrative. There's a stepping stone as to how your practice has developed.
Thanks for that deft curatorial spin on the practice. I appreciate it.
I can't stop laughing now. But I think that with work such as Choreograph Me that we've worked on before, which I think is a really great project in terms of the way of getting people to put gestures out for you to move in your body and giving people control over your body, liberating it in that way, but also feeling vulnerable by giving people control, right through to what you were doing with the lounging series, which was doing these long performances of you in one set position, which creates maybe sometimes a positive environment with an audience, but sometimes an uneasiness of the presence of a lounging body in that way. And I think that potential and that play is really what I value in your work, and I think is really important in your practice. If I did say so myself, but I think that there's a real value in the openness you have to that relationship. And I think it's a long-winded way of saying it, but I think this is where it comes into the work you did with Croydon Plays itself, in the sense of taking that idea of the ideas of the body and applying it to a location. And I find that really interesting to the way that you adapted that project. It felt for me that you're still using those same motifs you would with a body and thinking about it in terms of a town.
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, there's a kind of sort of anthropomorphizing of it as a sort of place. And the title of that sort of project was sort of partly comes about from this history of Croydon being a set used for a lot of kind of Hollywood films and big budget films as a kind of site of production and for shoots, but it never really playing itself. So it's always dressed as something else, or as New York or Gotham City or Istanbul, bizarrely, and I think just anecdotally, someone sort of saying that sort of Croydon was like in drag, because it's like it's always like made up to look like something else. And for me, that being a really kind of key in terms of the personification really of a place. And then for me, really thinking about my role as an outsider, being asked to kind of work with the Museum of Croydon and Turf Projects, which is this artist-run space in a shopping centre in the centre of Croydon. So trying to engage with these kind of local histories and contemporary culture, but as an outsider, and then sort of trying to navigate that through these conversations and shared actions and performances with people, where we kind of like explore different aspects really of the place.
Definitely. And I think that exploration into the idea of like, what does a location mean when it's been used in so many different ways to be dressed up as something else, and what does that mean to someone who has grown up in a place that has like a different relationship or connection to it to those who have seen it without realizing in all of these films. And I think those approaches that you've put into the color, the curatorial layout, the essence of smell added into the work, as well as the performance part, I think is really an interesting way of like making it as if within Turf Projects, as if that space is itself a body. When I kind of sense that work, I sense a smell, a touch, a taste, a sensation, the same way that I would if you were performing, if that makes any sense. So it feels like you've created an installation that is just an extension of is the body of Croydon in some way.
Yeah, that's a really good reading of it. I wish I'd had you there to say that at the time.
You can have it now. That's all yours. That's free.
Yeah, I need that. I should have more conversations with you, Paul. I always think that. No, that's actually sort of bang on. I mean, I guess I was more thinking at the time about a sort of sensory description of this place. But you're right. I think you're right to kind of, obviously that equates back to the body and the sense of, a sort of bodily experience. I was thinking of like how all those senses would, so there's a soundtrack, there's things for people to kind of take away and cook with and taste and smells, and there's things for people to kind of touch, and
and I think the next work that I kind of want to go on to before we wrap up is Mindfully Dizzy, just because I feel that there's something that was within that work that for me there's a sentence on your website, your new beautiful website, which says, let me just find it here, the value of paying focused attention to the overwhelming possibilities of our external environment. And for me, that felt incredibly pertinent to right now, because my external environment is something that I can't physically get into. My external environment is experienced through what I can see out of my window, my laptop screen, my phone, and those devices, and my TV that's always on in the corner of the room when I'm working hard, obviously from home. But the idea that the external environment has now become maybe obtuse to the body in some way, and I wondered, maybe riffing off that work a little bit, if there was any suggestions, tools, or ways forward you would think that you might adapt to making at this moment in time, or for other people who want to maintain making, you might have ideas for. If that makes any sense. It's quite a...
there's kind of lots in there. I mean, I'll eschew overly talking about Mindfully Dizzy, because I mean that work was sort of structurally trying to bring together a number of things that I'd been doing. One was working with this arts charity called Hospital Rooms, where artists are commissioned to make work for mental health wards. That so it emerged, that piece partly emerged out of a workshop that I did with some patients on a mental health ward in Croydon, actually, again. There was a series of rubbings, and then it led to a mural that was made in the ward. But there were aspects of that I sort of borrowed for this project, the Mindfully Dizzy project, which was really about trying to kind of speak about an idea of anxiety and this like riffing on this Kierkegaard quote by the sort of Danish philosopher, where he sort of describes anxiety as the sort of like, well, this idea, the analogy of like looking over the kind of over a cliff and looking down and feeling dizzy. And I sort of liked how the description kind of sort of was sensorial, so that like that idea, so it was kind of like in the body. So the work is sort of partly trying to evoke that and lead people into that space, and then again playing with language and thinking about dizziness like as a kind of embodied thing. But I think speaking to this experience of now, bizarrely, I mean, again, I'm going off perhaps on a slight anecdotal tangent, but what's happening at the moment just reminds me of my childhood. Because I was like one of the, I mean, they don't have these things, these, hopefully, well, I'm kind of careful what I say, retrospective. But basically, in the 80s, I was a latchkey kid. So this is a phrase that was used for, you know, so my mother like worked in a light bulb factory and she was a cleaner. And so when I got home from school, I'd let myself in. And I was just at home, and I was a little like a sad, geeky kid. I didn't go out and play with, you know, I just spent a lot of time indoors the whole time. And yeah, because I mean, I've got half siblings that are much younger than I am. So for a long time, I was used to my own company, and used to kind of just like reading and making stories and acting and dressing up, and really completely entertaining myself. So I feel like very comfortable in this space. And I know, so I find it quite difficult for other people who find it really hard to, I mean, obviously people are genuinely, I think, to be in all seriousness, dealing with loneliness and isolation, and there's some real issues around that. But I think it's partly interesting that this situation does force people to confront themselves, and I think that will throw up good and bad things. But yeah, for me personally, I feel like there are a number of endless possibilities, and I've made quite a lot of work where obviously it's just me in a space, just filming myself doing something. So I feel slightly like I've regressed. But I mean, I think also what I wanted to mention and talk about, which I think is perhaps more interesting and perhaps speaks to more what we're doing now, is the mediation of self and how that shapes an experience. And I think for me, what's really interesting now is this heightened sense of broadcast and transmission and reception. So how are you transmitting yourself? You know, everyone is trying to kind of use technology to mediate for this kind of social gap that we have at the moment. But I think it throws up now the materiality of broadcast. Like, what does it mean? I mean, obviously we've known about it through like Instagram and, you know, YouTube and all these kind of platforms, but now it's the primary platform.
It is the platform.
Before it's always the default. You live in the world, you get on the train, you get on the bus, whatever. But now everything is directed very much through these. So I think for me, there are all these possibilities now to really, really think about how people materially understand and experience the power and agency of broadcast, and the transmission and reception, those two things.
How to perceive, receive, and communicate in such a way that, I mean, it's really apparent, isn't it, that when you have these restrictions in terms of movement, how it's important to actually, you have to activate your own ways of communicating with people, such as setting up these conversations as an example. It's given kind of platforms for people to reconsider what it means to know what it means to be social. And I think you're completely right in terms of those kind of, these platforms that have always felt maybe separate, even though that we should see them as maybe entwined in our day-to-day lives, or actually become pertinently important to that experience. And I think that idea of broadcast is really interesting. I mean, Dawn and I tried to take part in a online dance party yesterday that didn't transpire very well due to the fact, well, the individual was playing the music from the speaker in their laptop, so no one could really hear it on their own devices. But the idea of having a collective dance party through your own platforms, to me, is really exciting, of rethinking where those moments of sociality can exist in these kind of times. But I think everything you've added there, Harold, has been amazing, and I want to thank you for all of your insights into your practice and kind of suggestions for ways forward with working. And I think ending with Mindfully Dizzy is a great place, because, you know, there's something else that you've written on your website that follows that quote from Kierkegaard of anxiety is the dizziness of freedom, but proposing that anxiety could be attributed to the dizzy feeling one might get when they are about to step into the unknown, a feeling of uncertainty but opportunity. And I think maybe that's the positive aspect to take from a very difficult and scary and fearful situation, isn't it?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, Harold, and enjoy
Great,
the rest of your
thank
evening.
you.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you.